One of the farthest reaching and most destructive aspects of this 19th century imperialism is the cultural imperialism that comes along with it. We've already talked about the economic effects on colonized people, the mass migrations due to labor, the environmental damage, etc. But really, the thing that has the most lasting effect is the forced cultural assimilation in a lot of these colonized areas. Now, in some colonized areas, the cultural assimilation is not forced. Many groups of people decide that in order to free themselves and in order to resist Western imperialism, they need to openly accept Western style politics, Western style technology, Western style culture, in order to compete on a global scale with the colonizers. So it's not always forced cultural assimilation, but in all of these colonized areas, there is some level of cultural assimilation, and as Western Judeo-Christian enlightened culture is assimilated, the native and the native and the indigenous culture suffers, and in some places is completely eradicated. So with the arrival of European colonizers comes European religion, technology, education, language, and through the work of European built schools, European missionaries, European built churches, a lot of different aspects of that Western culture become predominant in areas where it's not native or indigenous. In a lot of cases, it is forced through, forced attendance of public schools and through forced conversions. In a lot of cases, though, it's also a means of social mobility. People who were Western educated were regarded as the new elites within their own societies, whether this meant acceptance into mid levels of government, whether this meant acceptance into European military forces, or whether this just meant the cultural and social prestige that came along with this seemingly advanced and invincible Western style of life, right? For the most part, for the mass part of the population, the education that's provided is very basic. Obviously, there is education in Christianity and Christian beliefs. European languages are taught to huge amounts of the population. Reading, writing, clerical skills, all of these things that are designed to make the colonized population efficient administrators so that they can help better manage the colony. In a lot of cases, especially in Africa, this was kept within the lighter skinned ethnicities to maintain as much kind of racial hegemony as possible. Um, Large amounts of population, though, do volunteer and receive military training to help enlarge the military presence of the mother country. They become hugely important to the everyday control over the colony. Um, but one thing that you see not getting passed on is very little scientific and industrial knowledge. And in often cases, this is openly and willingly withheld from the native population because it would provide them with a tool that could then make render the colonizers useless to them. I mean, essentially, it would be something that would help close the gap between the colonized and the colonizers. So, technical knowledge, scientific knowledge, knowledge of legal systems, these types of things are very, very hard to come by for the colonized people. Um, Now, one of the really important aspects of this cultural assimilation that doesn't begin to take shape immediately, but develops over the later part of the 19th century and the earlier part of the 20th century, especially during and after the world wars, is that the Europeans focus on using race and ethnicity to qualify and to quantify and to segregate and divide different groups of people, leads to a growing sense of nationalism among these colonized groups. Um, as Europeans repeatedly and starkly point out to them on a daily basis through colonization that they are not like Europeans for this reason and that reason and this reason and that reason, and therefore, are not entitled to the same privileges as Europeans. It also begins to help these colonized peoples define what their nationality does mean, right? And in the early part of the 20th century, you see the rise of a lot of nationalistic movements in these colonized areas. The idea of Pan Africanism becomes very, very popular in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s and helps lead to decolonization in Africa. In the late 1800s, you see the formation of what's known as the Indian National Congress. Now, this is a mainly Hindu group and for the most part excludes the Muslim population of India, which would make it not completely nationalistic. But it is kind of a first step towards defining Indian nationalism. And it plays a huge role in driving the British out of India eventually. So, what you have here in the photos are some examples of the forms of education available to colonized people. Generally, again, it took the form of basic Western education, language, numbers, etc., things that would make them efficient administrators, or for the most part, it was military training, training that would allow them to be absorbed into the military forces of the mother country and able to help establish a firmer control, right? So, what you have here is a linguistic map of Africa. Now, this is circa the middle of the 20th century. So, this is circa the 1970s, I believe. And what you see here is a map showing the predominantly spoken languages in all of the decolonized African countries in the 1970s. And what you'll notice, and what is still prevalent today in Africa in 2018, is that foreign languages are far and away the dominant languages in Africa. English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and Arabic, all languages not native to the African continent. And although Arabic was brought there many, many, many centuries earlier with the expansion of the Islamic Caliphate, the majority of these languages arrive in the 19th century due to imperialism, and in the majority of these countries, they are still the predominant spoken language. This photo shows the collection of the first Indian National Congress in 1888. As you can see, this is a predominantly Hindu organization. There's not a lot of acceptance of Muslims, which we'll talk about the problems between Hindus and Muslims in India when we reach decolonization. But this is a first step towards Indian nationalism. This is a first step towards defining what it means to be Indian and how Indians would be able to rally together in order to break free of the British imperialism. Now, last and not least, we need to talk about the social disharmony, the social effects of imperialism on these colonized areas. First and foremost, the traditional ways of life in essentially every colonized area are massively disrupted. People, again, are moved forcibly off of their land. Millions of them are forced to migrate in search of work. Society is reorganized scientifically based on the ideas of tribe and race and language and ethnicity. In a lot of cases, this has disastrous side effects, especially in Africa, where the redrawing of the borders of Africa along political lines that suited Western Europeans leads to the division and combination of unnatural social groups. You had societies that had been enemies for centuries and had long-standing tensions would now be forced to live and work together under one established colonial rule. And this would lead to decades of social tensions and decades of political uprisings and problems in these countries after decolonization. Um, Another problem that arises after decolonization is the social issues between light skinned ethnicities and darker skinned ethnicities, especially in Africa. In a lot of cases, the light skinned ethnicities within the African population were promoted more readily and given more power within the colony because of these ideas of social Darwinism. And after decolonization, in a lot of cases, they were the minority in the population. And problems would develop between them and the dark skinned majority of the population based on this century of unnatural rule and power that they had been bestowed by these European colonizers. The situation in Rwanda in 1992 between the um, Tutsi minority and the Hutu majority is probably the most graphic and horrific example of this kind of problem taking place. Um, Another big disruption to the normal traditional way of life in a lot of these communities is that a lot of the male population becomes highly urbanized. They are forced to move into cities or they become migratory looking for labor opportunities, meaning that this would leave the indigenous societies to become female dominated, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but women are forced to take on a much greater role within these communities, especially in the areas of food production and politics, which were held as traditionally male roles. Um, and then one of the longest lasting social disruptions would be the extreme segregation of these colonial societies, which becomes known as apartheid. And apartheid is something that existed long beyond the end of colonization in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. In South Africa alone, this this process wasn't ended until I believe the middle of the 1990s. And essentially, what develops in this highly segregated society is, a system where whites and other races and ethnicities do not mix in any kind of social setting. They do not mix legally. They do not mix culturally unless it's the transfer of European culture to the natives. In some places, racial mixing is forbidden by law. Um, there are separate living areas, and I don't just mean neighborhoods. I mean entire communities where um, people who are not white or of European descent are simply not legally allowed to live or be in those areas. In a lot of these colonial societies, there were separate legal systems for whites and non whites. The educational system in these areas is again segregated by race, also. And like I said, I mean, this is a problem that's not fully solved and put to rest in many of these places, South Africa, Australia, for example, as well, until well into the 20th century. And in some cases, this segregation, even though it is no longer legal, still takes place culturally and socially for, basically reasons of tradition and economics even today.